Hello and welcome to the Business as Usual podcast, which is part of the Edify podcast network. This podcast series is a 5-part look at exam technique for the Edexcel A-level business specification. In the 5 parts of this series, we're going to look at the exams as a whole, each individual type of question, and including some ideas for structure and model answers. My name is Jack Goodrich and my usual co-host is Mike Sawyer. We're both teachers in schools in the UK. This series is just me, but Mike's going to be doing a similar series for Edexcel GCSE specification students and teachers soon. Let's get started. Welcome to the Business as Usual podcast. This series is aimed at students who are doing the Edexcel A-level business in particular, and it's a focus on exam technique. And so this first one is about the exams, how to read the questions, and paragraph structures. Just a little bit of an introduction. This podcast series is aimed at students of the Edexcel A-level in business. The podcast in general is aimed at students of all exam boards and not just A-level. It's also aimed at GCSE. But because we do teach Edexcel, the two of us who host this, all of our exam technique sessions are going to focus specifically on that. So if you're not studying the Edexcel A-level business, then you're probably not going to find this one quite as useful as you might find other episodes of the podcast. This series is split into 5 short podcasts. They're going to be uploaded as podcasts on Spotify or on YouTube as videos. My personal recommendation would be that the first time you're watching through this, use the YouTube video because just having the ability to see what's on screen will help. If you're then maybe looking to just refresh yourself on these things, or you're a bit more experienced, perhaps if you're later on in year 13, then the podcast might be completely suitable. So there's the 5 in this series. The first one's just going to be an introduction into how I get my students to structure their answers. So we're going to have a little bit of a breakdown of what the exams look like, how you might structure your paragraphs, and what the question looks like. We're going to then do 4 separate exam question type little mini pods, little mini videos. One on the 4 markers, and there's 3 different types of 4 marker. One on an 8 marker, another on 10 and 12 markers because they're very similar. And then lastly, we'll do a session on the 20 markers. Each of them are going to include examples of what the questions might look like and a model answer, or at least parts of a model answer. So you can have a look and sort of see how these paragraph structures and these ways of answering the questions look in practice. So before we start looking at how to answer the exam papers, we need to know what the exam papers look like. And we're going to focus on the A2 papers here because I know that a lot of centres, the majority of centres, don't do the AS papers. So the A2 has 3 exam papers, paper 1, paper 2, and paper 3, and they all have similarities in that in all of them they have 2 sections, and all of them are worth the same amount of marks and have the same amount of time allocated. So all 3 papers are worth 100 marks, and all 3 papers you get 2 hours. I've put a little asterisk there because you may qualify for extra time for a variety of reasons. And so if that's the case, usually it's 25%, so that would give you an extra half an hour. Paper 1 and paper 2 are very similar. The only difference is that they cover different themes. So for example, both paper 1 and paper 2 are worth 35% of the total A-level qualification. So paper 1 and paper 2 carry a little bit more in terms of mark weighting than paper 3 does. The other similarity is that they include 4 markers, 10 markers, 12 markers, and 20 mark questions. And so effectively the way it works is there's 2 sections, and in each section you have 2 4 markers, a 10 marker, a 12 marker, and a 20 marker, which equates to 50 marks in total. That's the same for both paper 1 and paper 2. Paper 1 covers themes 1 and 4, and paper 2 covers themes 2 and 3. There's a few little differences between those and paper 3. The first is that paper 3 only gives you 30% of the total A-level qualification marks. And then the second difference is that instead of having the 4 markers, you're going to get an 8-mark essay question. And so I think timing-wise makes the paper 3 a little bit more tricky because you have to write 8 essays instead of 6 essays and 4 short answer questions. The third difference is that paper 3 covers all 4 themes, but obviously, given that you do paper 1, 2, and 3 in order, by the time you get onto paper 3, you've already revised themes 1, 2, 3, and 4 for paper 1 and paper 2. The fourth, and probably the biggest difference here, is that paper 3 is always going to be about a specific industry or business or a selection of businesses, and that information is given to students and given to teachers in November before the exams. So it's based on a pre-release, and so your teachers will be getting you to do a bunch of research on a particular market or industry. You'll see that on our YouTube channel. We do a big sort of podcast and video for those every year. We've done that for the last few years. So there's loads of resources, and you don't need to do huge amounts of research in your own time. Things like videos online will be more than sufficient. Before we go into sort of specific tips about how to structure paragraphs and how to answer the question, I just want to give you a few little other exam tips. These are probably the three most important things that I think are worth knowing before you start looking at the exam questions. The first is timing. My advice is to split the paper into half and treat it as two small exams rather than one large exam. So both sections are worth 50 marks and it's a 2-hour paper. So both sections give you 1 hour. That's how I would do it. And I would be very careful not to cross between sections. Do all of section A and then all of section B. It just helps you with your timing to get that right. So use a watch to plan and track your timing. You should have an idea that, for example, if you're doing an 8-marker, you should know that that should take you 8 minutes. And so after about 10 or 12 minutes of the exam, you should have finished that first question. And also then you'll know that if you haven't finished section A after the first hour, you'll know that you're not on track in terms of your timing. Try and stick to roughly 1 mark per minute. I know that sometimes this isn't possible, but try to as much as possible so that you'll know how much time you've got left and how many marks you've got left to cover. That gives you 10 minutes extra in each half. So you'd have 60 minutes for each half of the paper and 50 marks. So you would use that 10 minutes to read the extracts and use the extracts. But also it does then allow you maybe a minute or two to run over on certain questions if you need to. But you've got to be really careful. You can't afford to run over by sort of 3-4 minutes more than once without it affecting your overall timing. In terms of organizations, I've already mentioned this, but do the sections in order. I know that some students don't. Some students prefer to do the 20 marker first, but the intention when these exam papers are written is that these questions lead you up to the 20 marker. And by the time you get to the 20 marker, you've used a variety of different parts of the case study. You've got a pretty good idea of what the extracts are telling you, and therefore you're better equipped to answer the 20 marker. But if you are going to do things in a different order, make sure you don't cross sections. So if you're going to do section A in a different order and you'd rather do the 20 marker first, that's fine, but don't do both 20 markers first because it becomes really difficult to then organize your timing when you're crossing sections and you go away from that 1 hour per section. So those would be my 2 bits of advice for organization. The last big thing I want to focus on is using the extracts. Make sure, my advice to students is always to read the questions for a section before reading the extracts. I wouldn't bother reading section B until you've done section A. But when you open that exam paper, the first thing I would be doing is I'd be reading the 5 or 4 questions in that section and then reading the extracts. That way, you can try and figure out which question links to which part of the extract. And sometimes you might find that more than one question linked to one extract. Sometimes it might only be half of an extract that you need for an answer. But the questions and the extracts are written together. And so therefore, they have to be used hand in hand. Make sure that every answer that you write refers to the extract. In the AS papers, there's 2 markers, which are just definition questions. They're the only questions that don't require application. Every other question does. And so if you don't use the extract, you're not answering the question. I would always advise use a direct quote. And what I mean by direct quote is if there's a bit of data, say the data. Don't just refer to it. Say what the data is. Put it in quote marks. Use the statistics so that it's really easy for the examiner to see where you've used your application. The question, every question has 3 elements, and this is an example question on the screen. So this is from a past exam paper or a sample assessment material. I can't remember where. But the question is, assess the likely consequences of EBAC Limited continuing to operate as a private limited company. And this is a 10 marker. Every question has these 3 categories, these 3 elements. The first is the question prompt. So in this case, it is assess the likely consequences. And so from that, we can take a few things. The fact it says assess the means we know it's going to be a 10 or 12 marker. Don't worry if you can't recognize that now. We're going to come to that as we get to the 10 and 12 markers and the 8 markers. And you can see the difference between assess for an 8 marker and assess for a 10 and 12 marker. The fact it says the likely consequences means that when we're looking through the extract and we're thinking about this business, we have to think about what the consequences are of, in this case, being a private limited company. There's also always a keyword. In this case, it's private limited company. That's the knowledge that you would have gained by studying the specification. And there's always a business. And in this case, it's EBAC Limited. You don't need to know anything about EBAC Limited. The case study, the extract, will give you more than enough information, but you do need to recognize that EBAC Limited are a key part of this question, because if you don't talk about them, then you're not answering the question. I've got my students for the last few years to write a peach paragraph structure. This is something that I came up with when this course first started, and originally it got published on Tutor2U, but then they came up with their own paragraph structure, so they took mine down. But I know that a lot of schools across the country are using this, and it's gone through some little changes over the course of time as the years have gone on, and we found different ways to make it suitable. But the sort of key components of a peach paragraph are: P is point, E is effect, A is application, C is circumstance or circumstances, and H is however. And I'm going to go through what each of these different parts mean, and then I'm going to show you an example of a peach paragraph just so I can show you how it actually looks in practice, because it might look like quite a lot of things to get into one paragraph, but actually each of these only needs to really be a sentence to have a really strong answer that ticks all the boxes that the examiners are looking for. So the first is with our point, and you want to be really clever with the first sentence of your paragraph. Make your point really clear to the examiner. My advice is always to use the words of the question. And so in the example that I'm going to show you in a second, I will use the words of the question in that first sentence. Then you've got to think about what effect this point has on the business. If that is a consequence, if it's a benefit, if it's a factor, you need to think about how do you actually answer the question now? What is the consequence? What effect does this consequence have on the business? Think like, what does it change? And make sure that it's linked to that prompt. Make sure it's linked to whatever the words of the question were asking you for, the prompt of the question that we've just gone through. You then, in order to answer the question, need to support it with quotes or data from the extract. This is one of the key skills, so this allows for your application to the business in the question. My advice, as I mentioned already, would be to use direct quotes. You might make your points based on what you read in the extracts. You might just use the extract to support a point that you've already made based on something else. Either way, you need to make sure that you use application, and you're going to struggle to get any much more than half marks if you don't have this. The C is circumstance. So think about, is there anything else about the circumstances that the business is in that you can use to develop your point? Anything you might know about competitors, market information, financial position? This is probably the hardest one to get right consistently, and you might find that sometimes you don't have a good circumstance point, and in which case, hope that your point, effect, and application have been strong enough that you don't need it. But this is where you'd use your sort of general knowledge about business. This is where you'd use any information that's in the extract that maybe isn't already being used in your application, but you can use to support your answer, because it talks about maybe the wider position of the business. And then the last one is one of the most important, and that is the however point. And if the question says assess two benefits, even though it's saying to assess two benefits, you still need to provide balance. In the vast majority of questions, you need to provide counterbalance to the point that you've made. And that's where the however comes in. So you've got to think about the limitations of the point you've made. You've made a point and you've argued it, but to assess something is to consider both sides of the argument. And so as a result, you also have to think about, maybe there's a reason why the benefit you've just said and explained with your effect and your application and your circumstances, maybe there's a reason why that might not actually benefit. And so this is the point at which you do that. The way you'd use your however, whether your however would be an entirely new paragraph or an entirely new section, we'll talk about when we do the individual sections on each type of exam question. But all you really need to know is that the however is there to provide balance. And to be honest, when creating the peach paragraph, I started with point evidence, explain that common one that's used in GCSE. And I knew that in order to get the evaluation marks, I knew that we needed to have some sort of counterbalance. And so I was trying to figure out words that started in P and then ended in H. And by luck, we managed to come up with this sort of peach that managed to hit that criteria. But that, however, is really, really important. I want to show you an example of a peach paragraph. And so here is one written about this 8 marker. So assess 2 factors that could affect the demand for Tesco. Now, obviously, I'm not showing a case study here. And so as a result, you're going to have to just trust that the application I've got comes from a case study. The point, we're going to use the words of the question as I mentioned. So one factor that could affect the demand for Tesco is bad publicity in the media. Now, from that sentence, as an examiner, I would be able to look at that sentence and think, right, if they do the next bits correctly, I know that that's a fine point. And I know that it's talking about a factor that could affect the demand, and it's talking about Tesco. It's using all of the prompts from the question and the words of the question. So providing the next sets of criteria, the effect, the application, the circumstance, etc., providing they're all hit, I know that this is going to be a decent answer. And that first sentence is really important in setting that tone. For the effect, this is likely to lead to a damaged brand image, and some customers may decide to shop elsewhere at competitors. So nothing really that in depth there, nothing really that significant, but I've just explained how this factor could affect the demand for Tesco. I'm saying that it could potentially lower demand. Then my application, I need to support my point with something from the case study. So I've said here, competitors such as Asda, Sainsbury's and Morrison's possess 38% market share. So I'm using a statistic there. And there is news that, and here I use a quote, Tesco have misled shareholders regarding profit figures within their annual report. So that's maybe the reason why they're going to have bad publicity in the media. My circumstance, this would affect demand for Tesco as they're already under pressure from low-cost producers such as Aldi and Lidl who have seen significant growth. So maybe that's not in the case study, maybe it is. But I know that about the market. I know that Aldi and Lidl have been growing and Tesco have been struggling. So I can bring that in. I can bring in my general business knowledge and it does support the point that I'm making and hopefully impresses an examiner. As I mentioned just previously, we need to make sure we get that however in. So however, the change in demand may not be significant as many customers remain loyal to their chosen supermarket as they've built up trust over a longer period of time. So I've made my point and I've explained my point. I think it's a fair point that it could affect the demand for Tesco. But then in my however, I provide that balance. So in order to assess 2 factors, I need to provide balance and explain why maybe that factor won't affect the demand. And in this case, I'm saying Tesco are a huge company. They've got brand loyalty. Some consumers might not change because of that brand loyalty. When we put that all together into one paragraph, you'll see that that's only the 5 sentences, and it doesn't put together a huge paragraph. You don't have to write pages and pages and pages to get good marks. But what hopefully you'll see is that one paragraph ticks all of the boxes that an examiner is looking for. And in the other sections, we'll have a look at what the different sort of mark bands are like for each question. So you can have a look at exactly what the examiners are looking for when they're marking your answers. So thanks for watching the part 1 of this 5-part series on exam technique for A-level business at Edexcel. If you want to catch the others, you can subscribe to us on YouTube or follow us on Spotify if you search for the Business as Usual podcast. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at BusinessAUPod. Should be the same tag for both of those. So follow us on there and keep up to date. And if there's anything in particular that you want from any of from a series or from our podcast, don't hesitate to get in touch.